îl știm noi din vremuri strămoșești, cuvânt de dor și luptă, de doine și povești. Dar dacă astăzi pacea e lege și sfut, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. Cuvinte le-am moștenit în grai, doar bănuiam ce înseamnă, ce tâlcuri au sub strai. Dar dacă astăzi tâlcul de plin l-am priceput, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. костяк, в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, реют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжается бой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы. Будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути. И он продолжает собой, и сердце тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь.
Greetings, everybody, and welcome. It is the evening of the 21st of June, 2025, and here we are with a live stream on the question of the proletarian dictatorship. And I'm just going to make sure your comments can all be seen at the side of the screen. There we go. And so what do we mean by this, and why is this of interest? What I want to start to do on a regular basis on the channel is to explore some absolutely crucial concepts from revolutionary history and current practice. And the question of the dictatorship of the proletariat is one of the elements of Marxism-Leninism, which is often talked about but little understood. And of course, there we have to compare it directly to the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. So we're going to be doing a series of programs on this going forward, mostly on a Saturday night, because this is a way better Saturday night entertainment than anything you'll find on television or your insert name of streaming service here. So yes, look forward to this on a regular basis. So moving to the question then of what is the dictatorship of the proletariat and why is it a necessity? I mean, this is something which goes all the way back to Marx himself when talking about the future for in the fight for socialism, and this also comes up in, of course, frequently in Lenin, so who famously said, quote, "Only he is a Marxist who extends the recognition of class struggle to the recognition of the dictatorship of the proletariat." Because, of course, Lenin was engaged frequently in controversies with various cretinous representatives of the Second International who would not call for or back or seek to develop the dictatorship of the proletariat. People like, of course, earlier you had the early revisionists such as Edward Bernstein, who only believed in bourgeois parliamentarism as being an acceptable means of change. And later on, you've got, of course, Karl Kautsky, who went down exactly the same road, and the leadership of those who were the sort of wobbling pacifist elements in World War I, like Kautsky, who ended up trying to fuse in the Weimar era Soviets and bourgeois parliamentarism, because, of course, bourgeois parliamentarism crushed all life out of the workers, soldiers, and sailors' councils in Germany post-1918. Because, of course, capitalism remained the mode of production. The capitalist class retained ownership of the means of production. And so it was the bourgeois political system which was going to triumph in that situation. And so Lenin had to spend quite a considerable amount of time advocating for and defending the dictatorship of the proletariat and being able to the proletariat's rights and responsibilities under that system to exercise that dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. Now, what we find when we look at the dictatorship of the proletariat is that it's again, as I said, one of the most little understood elements of Marxism. Even though Marx himself was quite clear about it when in 1852 he wrote to Wedermeyer and said, "No credit is due to me for discovering the existence of classes in modern society, nor yet the struggle between them. Long before me, bourgeois historians had described the historical development of this struggle of the classes, and bourgeois economists the economic anatomy of the classes. What I did was to prove, one, that the existence of classes is bound up with particular historical phases in the development of production. Two, that the class struggle necessarily leads to the dictatorship of the proletariat. Three, that this dictatorship itself only constitutes the transition to the abolition of all classes and to a classless society." So, for those of you who are familiar with the development of Marxist thought, you can see here that he again draws from a lot of what the bourgeois historians from the earlier 19th century and the Enlightenment period had said, which was that as he says, the existence of classes is bound up with particular historical phases in the development of production. So, Roman slave owners and slaves, feudal lords and peasants, or should we say, going beyond, if we're talking about antiquity, going beyond the Romans, so citizens in the Greek sense of property owners and slaves, citizens with the political rights and slaves with none, similar in Roman society, but of course you had added into that the significant class of plebeians as well. And then you have the feudal aristocracy and the great vast masses of the peasantry. And now you have the capitalist and the proletarian, each bound into a different particular phase of the development of different modes of production. and a class struggle between all of these classes is inevitable, and that you are looking at a dictatorship of one class in each of these societies. And that changes over time as the mode of production changes, and therefore the nature of the state and the wider society changes as well, and it evolves or de-evolves sometimes. So, and class struggle is an essential part of the dynamic moving that forward. So, for instance, the class struggle over wages in the 19th century that Marx was observing in the English factory system led to development of means of production on the one hand, because the bourgeoisie was forced to innovate to try and get rid of skilled workers by automating certain elements of production, and also due to the extended class struggles of the 19th century and the dangers that they posed to bourgeois property, the bourgeoisie was obliged to make political concessions, whilst at the same time trying to render those concessions null and void via various other maneuvers. So you see in these small examples that I'm giving here that how society is changed continually by the necessity of class struggle, and by the response of each class to the moves of the other. So when we're getting to the point where the capitalist classes and the landlord class has fallen, and the proletariat in the Russian and Chinese cases in close alliance with the peasantry, and in the Chinese case other progressive national patriotic forces that had fought the Japanese and had also fought for the freeing of the nation from the domination of it by the imperialists. Now, when you are building the socialist order, you'll now proceed to construct the socialist order, as Lenin once said. You need to be able to suppress the enemies of the revolution, which is how part of why the dictatorship of the proletariat is absolutely necessary. Because at the moment, and since capitalism emerged, we have the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. Now, what does this actually mean? What does the dictatorship of any class actually mean in practice? What it means is that, first of all, you have it expressed through, let's just use the example of the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie here. You have it expressed through law, through the legitimation of bourgeois rule, through laws, and through various other sort of procedural elements within the state. With also regard to the state, it is, as Marx and Engels said, it's a managing committee for the affairs, in capitalist terms, of the affairs of the entire bourgeoisie. And from the bourgeois ownership of the means of production and their development of the means of production, this flows into the development of the state, of its various legal forms, of its various institutions. Yes, it is true to an extent that the state is shifted and changed by various different class struggles, but it still fundamentally remains a bourgeois state. The class struggle within the confines of bourgeois society can make the state shift, it can make it change certain aspects of itself, but it can't change the class nature of it. The state remains a bourgeois state because it is an expression of the bourgeois dictatorship. And the bourgeois dictatorship, of course, stretches outside of legal and administrative functions and as Lenin said in State and Revolution, the special bodies of armed men. It stretches beyond that into the field of culture. And this is where theorists like Antonio Gramsci are so useful, because the field of culture also serves to act as legitimating tendencies, or build legitimating tendencies for the rule of the bourgeoisie, in that it seeks to, sometimes quite deliberately, given how much influence the capitalist state has over bourgeois cultural development. Sometimes you see the Pentagon, the CIA, MI5, MI6, and others directly intervening in cultural programming to boost one message or another. Sometimes, though, bourgeois culture is just an expression of bourgeois ideology. It doesn't need, sometimes it doesn't need the direct intervention of the state forces to render it into propaganda. You see ideology, here we go into Zizek, ideology at its purest is when it is not needed to be ordered at all, which is, of course, one of Zizek's go-to phrases, but of course he didn't invent that. That is one of his sort of that's part of his ripping off of Marxism, Leninism. But it is a correct observation, which is that when it comes to culture, yes, the bourgeoisie and its forces will seek to intervene to shape narratives through the culture, but a lot of the time, cultural products are ideology at their purest, meaning that a writer doesn't need to be told what to write. A writer will just write whatever the ruling ideology deems acceptable, because otherwise you don't get promoted. You don't need necessarily the iron hand, or the iron fist, I should say, of the state forces slamming down over everybody's head every 10 seconds, when the systems of bourgeois management in the culture industry reward certain behaviors and punish others. But the bourgeois dictatorship is very much expressed through culture. These cultural products seek to produce and reproduce bourgeois values in various different ways. And when we are reviewing and analyzing products of bourgeois culture, we must, and this is something I'm going to try and do more of in the future, take into account not just what is there on screen, be it from filmmaking or television or theatre, so you're reviewing what's on stage, or reviewing a book, what's on the page. So you shouldn't just be reviewing, if we're doing this in a Marxist-Leninist fashion, what's on the page, stage, screen, etc., but the conditions under which it is produced. So if you're reviewing a cultural product, you have to review the conditions under which it came to be put on the screen, put on the stage, put on the page. The ways and means by which that was done is also very important to consider. So the dictatorship of a class is all-encompassing, because that class not only owns and controls the means of production, but constantly seeks to take that control further, constantly seeks to reaffirm bourgeois values, particularly amongst the suppressed class, the proletariat in our case, or in the case of areas of the world, countries in the world with an extensive peasantry, the proletariat and the peasantry. And even in the case of the imperialist countries, the proletariat, both urban and rural, and significant sections of the petty bourgeoisie as well, and the lumpens. Cultural products are very important when it comes to that. And the reinforcement of the values of the bourgeoisie, or the values that they have cooked up and want you to imbibe and embody, that's a very important piece of work for the bourgeois state, bourgeois social institutions, and bourgeois culture to push into our minds from the earliest possible stage all the bourgeois values, in order that they can rule without too much resort to open violence, though that's becoming increasingly difficult for them to do these days. So when considering then the question of the dictatorship of the proletariat, you then have to look at it in the sense that what you're aiming to do is, on the one hand, it should be easier, because what we're aiming to do is to build a state, initially anyway, a series of administrative methods and a culture that is representative of the great majority of the population in any given country, and also to produce and reproduce proletarian values within the working class, and also to produce in terms of the state, in terms of the economic setup, in terms of the cultural setup. You need to produce a certain proletarian ideology which will guide the struggle. And here we come to the question of the struggle itself, because the purpose of the dictatorship of the proletariat is, of course, to struggle against the reoccurrence of the bourgeois values and the return of the bourgeoisie. And this is the primary purpose as expressed by Lenin and others. So the reason why you have the dictatorship of the proletariat is to, first of all, to stamp out and suppress the remaining elements of the old ruling class. So the old capitalist class, the landlords, etc., depending upon which country you're in, and the promotion into power of the proletariat via the Soviets and via the workers' state. And so initially it is a matter of creating the new workers' state and suppressing the old holdout elements of the bourgeoisie. And you have to, of course, suppress the old elements of the fallen ruling class, because you have to make sure that the enemy is comprehensively defeated. If you leave them in place, or if you leave them to grow their power back again, particularly if the revolution is isolated to one or two or three countries, and especially if the power of imperialism remains, then you have to actively struggle against the allies of imperialism in your country as part of your revolutionary process. And if you don't actively struggle against them, then they will find that their power regrows again, especially if you're in a country that's part of the neo-colonial world and you're struggling against a domestic bourgeoisie which has been linked to imperialism. Then you leave that bourgeoisie in place, which is essentially comprador in nature, then it will always seek to drift back towards rebuilding its relationship with imperialism. There's a great quote from Mao in 1936, where he said in a speech entitled "The Situation and Our Policy After the Victory in the War of Resistance Against Japan," he said the following: "Everything reactionary is the same. If you don't hit it, it won't fall. It is like sweeping the floor. Where the broom does not reach, the dust never vanishes of itself." And this is, of course, very true, and it necessitates an active struggle, which is both political, legal to an extent, in that the proletarian state builds its own law, and also it is economic, because, as Lenin observed, bourgeois relations have a tendency to, well, in the Russian case that he was talking about, the wider Soviet case, bourgeois relations have a tendency to regrow via small production, which Lenin was talking about in the late 1900s, when the Civil War was still being fought and they were trying to work out how to build the dictatorship of the proletariat. So the question of the necessity of that, I think, is very clear. And what this means in practice, though, is that it's not only the case that one must have a proletarian or workers' state that can guard the revolution and that can take action to squash rebellions. It's that the lessons of the socialist countries in the 20th century and into the 21st century, particularly in the Soviet Union and the old Eastern Bloc, the lesson there is that if one slackens off on the struggle to any great degree, then what you find is that the bourgeois values can grow back. And this can even happen in a country which has nominally done away with the bourgeoisie. Now, how does this happen? We're going to use the Soviet Union as an example, but all of the people's democracies suffered from similar problems. So you have the great struggles in the 1930s to carry out mass industrialization to catch up with the imperialist powers, and due to the successful struggles waged in the 1920s, there were huge successes won in the 1930s in terms of industrialization, and of course the implementation of the dictatorship of the proletariat, by the CPSU, and you can find various different written accounts of how the dictatorship of the proletariat worked in question, and the question of, with regard to the question of the exercise of power. So you have books like people like Anna Louise Strong, by Pat Sloan on Soviet democracy, looking at this. And what you found is that the dictatorship of the proletariat was particularly strong in places like the factories, where the factory workers could exercise a great deal of influence over how the factory was run in a way that would be unthinkable of course, in a bourgeois state, in a bourgeois society. And now, what it becomes clear, though, through the work of people like Grover Furr and others, is that this dictatorship of the proletariat that existed in the 1930s in the Soviet Union, and of course the strong alliance that the proletariat had with the peasantry, was something that was it was strong enough to endure the barbarities of the Hitlerites and the invasion, and it was strong enough to win the Great Patriotic War, but it was not without problems. And the problems came principally from within the CPSU itself. And again, this is something that Grover Furr and others have written about. It comes out through the work of the old bourgeois scholar Arch Getty, when looking at like the purges and what's referred to as the Great Terror, which is that the biggest actual opponents of the dictatorship of the proletariat, aside from, of course, the imperialists who scream and cry and wail hypocritical tears about it, aside from the fascists and the domestic open reactionaries, aside from the paid agents of imperialism, who are the biggest external enemies, there's a big internal enemy of the dictatorship of the proletariat, and that comes from in the form of what are best described as the bourgeois elements within the Soviet Party itself. And these prove to be the base of what is now known as Khrushchevite revisionism. And Khrushchevite revisionism, of course, took up as its task the abolition of the dictatorship of the proletariat and the pushing out of the working class from its role in the active management of Soviet industry and industrial, political, and cultural life, and the replacement of the dictatorship of the proletariat with the fraudulent practice of the state of the whole people, which is one of Khrushchev's horrendous little innovations, which showed clearly where things were going. What you find in the 1940s is that Stalin, Zhdanov, and Kaganovich, Molotov, and others find themselves actually in a struggle against a significant majority of the party first secretaries, which again, Khrushchev was a party first secretary, principally in Ukraine. And also a lot of the senior industrial managers, various bureaucrats in the state machine. These were the bases of Khrushchevite revisionism. So it's senior bureaucratic elements within the party, a certain layer of intellectuals, certain elements within the factory management system, and of course, again, to go back to the intellectuals again, some people within the scientific and technological base. And it is against those people that Stalin's last struggle was conducted. And it's pretty clear by now, and again, Grover Furr has done a really good job like digging out evidence of this, that from the Soviet archives, that Stalin and his closest comrades were actually in a minority in the Central Committee of the CPSU by the time Stalin died. Now, this was all covered over. I mean, part of the reason why, like, Khrushchev was actually one of the biggest enthusiasts of the Stalin cult was that he was essentially covering over the fact that he and others were openly, sometimes, and covertly at other times, pushing to end the proletarian dictatorship and start restoring capitalism. Whether, by the way, whether they thought that's what they were doing or not is irrelevant. This is the practical effect of what they did. What you find is that you get, again, like Stalin himself was in a minority. Stalin's closest collaborators were actually in a minority. They had been, for various different reasons, which I don't have time to go into now, outmaneuvered by the Khrushchevites. Well, Khrushchev was, of course, his name is attached to revisionism, but he was merely the most he was the chosen man of this bureaucratic layer that was always a danger, and Stalin always knew was a danger in the party. And that's why you see some bourgeois historians saying it was good that Stalin died when he did, because he was preparing another purge against the party. And what they mean by that is he was preparing, if that tale is to be believed, that Stalin was fully aware of the fact that he was now in a minority inside the Central Committee of the CPSU, and he needed to bring forward revolutionaries into the system of the party and the government to counteract people he knew very well were revisionists, but because he was in a minority on his own Central Committee, couldn't act openly against, so he needed to balance out against them. That's why he was trying to promote newer revolutionaries into roles in the hierarchy. By the time that he died too early to complete that process. And one of the first things, and this is noted now by Russian sources, that Khrushchev did was to dismiss the newly promoted people and to start the process of undoing the central planning mechanisms in the economy. And again, like you can find there's a lot of resources out there now on how Khrushchev began the process of restoring market relations inside the USSR. Privatization of the tractor stations being one of those, but also, and this is where you start to see an increasing amount of damage done by Khrushchev in restoring bourgeois relations inside industry. What do I mean by this? They start to, in the Khrushchev era, they start to relate to go more and more towards bourgeois methods of trying to produce greater growth. So bonuses for factory managers, financial motivations for senior managers in the industrial system, more bonuses for meeting production quotas, the pushing out of workers from playing an active role in the formulation of the various different economic plans. And this stage also, Khrushchev actively promoted the consumption of alcohol, and said that what the proletariat needs is, of course, more consumer goods, and we need to copy the consumerist societies of the West. This was the way in which the Soviet Union was progressing. So what emerges under Khrushchev, and this is the reason why they get rid of the dictatorship of the proletariat, is that the influence of the worker over his or her factory or workplace is marginalized, is downgraded. The number of actual workers in senior positions in the party or in the Supreme Soviet goes steadily down in the Khrushchev era. The worker, rather than being the master of society, rather than being the developing ruling class, is sort of pushed to one side bit by bit, and this goes on throughout the Khrushchev period. So hence you get that formulation about not a dictatorship of the proletariat, but a state of the whole people. And then Khrushchev's and Brezhnev's moved to talk about the fact that they were now in a situation of developed socialism. Now, Lenin would have laughed at that with scorn, as would Stalin, as would Mao, because you're only a couple of generations away from a revolution, surrounded in a country that's surrounded by enemies, despite the growth in the socialist world post 1945. Imperialism is still very much an active and rampaging force. So to talk of developed socialism and to deny specifically the need for class struggle after the revolution, that is one of the most fundamental essences of revisionism. It's the denial that class struggle continues after the revolution for a long time, and an active struggle must be waged against bourgeois elements for a long time afterwards. And this is why I say that, like, it's not just a question of whether a country that's been through a revolution has like market elements within its system or not. To use the example of the new economic policy, Lenin, when talking about the NEP, was always clear that the NEP was a necessary retreat, and he urged the party to agitate along these lines, to explain to the masses that what was needed was a temporary retreat to regrow the economy. Lenin saw it as a retreat from socialism, and the whole way in which this was portrayed to the wider working class was that it was a necessary retreat. So Lenin was clear. He called it a strategical retreat. So I'm just going to read to you now from an article from 1921. This is called "The New Economic Policy and the Tasks of the Political Education Departments." Report to the Second All-Russia Congress of Political Education Departments, October 17th, 1921. So it starts off by saying that we need to speak about making a mistake. So, and then he moves on to talk about the need for, as I've said, he calls it a strategical retreat. And I'll just read this section to you. At that time, when in the heat of the Civil War we had to take necessary steps in economic organization, it seemed to have been forgotten. In substance, our new economic policy signifies that, having sustained severe defeat on this point, we have started a strategical retreat. We said, in effect, before we are completely routed, let us retreat and reorganize everything, but on a firmer basis. If communists deliberately examine the question of the new economic policy, there cannot be the slightest doubt in their minds that we have sustained a very severe defeat on the economic front. In the circumstances, it is inevitable, of course, for some people to become very despondent, almost panic-stricken, because of the retreat. These people will begin to give way to panic. That is inevitable. When the Red Army retreated, was its flight from the enemy not the prelude to its victory? Every retreat on every front, however, caused some people to give way to panic for a time. But on each occasion, on the Kolchak front, on the Denikin front, on the Yudenich front, on the Polish front, on the Wrangel front, once we had been badly battered, and sometimes more than once, we proved the truth of the proverb: a man who has been beaten is worth two who haven't. After being beaten, we began to advance slowly, systematically, and cautiously. Of course, tasks on the economic front are much more difficult than tasks on the war front, although there is a general similarity between two elementary outlines of strategy. In attempting to go over straight to communism, we in the spring of 1921 sustained a more serious defeat on the economic front than any defeat inflicted upon us by Kolchak, Denikin, or Pilsudski. This defeat was much more serious, significant, and dangerous. It was expressed in the isolation of the higher administrators of our economic policy from the lower, and their failure to produce that development of the productive forces which the program of our party regards as vital and urgent. The surplus food appropriation system in the rural districts, this district communist approach to the problem of urban development, hindered the growth of the productive forces and proved to be the main cause of the profound economic and political crisis that we experienced in the spring of 1921. That was why we had to take a step which, from the point of view of our line of our policy, cannot be called anything else than a very severe defeat and retreat. Moreover, it cannot be said that this retreat is, like the retreats of the Red Army, a completely orderly retreat, previously prepared positions. True, the positions of our present retreat were prepared beforehand. That can be proved by comparing the decisions adopted by our party in the spring of 1921 to the one adapted in April 1918, which I have mentioned. The positions were prepared beforehand, but the retreat of these positions took place and is still taking place in many parts of the country in disorder and even in extreme disorder. So, the reason why I read that out is because what you have there is a very clear exposition of the fact that there is a retreat going on, the fact that there is what has produced it, and why, like, agitators from the party should go out and be clear with the workers as to what has gone on and why. See, what you're doing there, what Lenin's doing now, is that even in a retreat, you have to give a proper political explanation to the working class. And that's why if you have to make a retreat, it is not necessarily a disaster as long as you retain the links with the masses and the ability to mobilize the masses in defense of the revolution. So in the case of the NEP, the reason why it wasn't necessarily a complete, it wasn't going to it didn't end up a complete disaster, was that the CPSUB, as they became, explained properly the problems facing them and the problems facing economic construction to the masses. They properly explained to the proletariat and the peasantry what was going on, why there was a new course being pursued, what had necessitated the new course, and in that way you retain the hopefully, and they did in this case, the allegiance of the workers and peasants to the party and the state. And that is why, when forced to retreat, one must be completely honest. Now, must also seek to continue to build the power of the dictatorship of the proletariat all the way through that period of the NEP. And that was a difficult thing to do, and of course to constantly build and rebuild and strengthen the alliance with the peasantry. And so you compare that to the Khrushchevite revisionists, who, first of all, deliberately started to dismantle central planning as soon as Stalin died, 1953. That was done. They then pushed out, marginalized the revolutionary elements in the party, and completely engaged in an act of deliberate sabotage of the collective history of the party during the 20th Congress, which, of course, 20th Congress with the so-called secret speech was a secret speech that was heard inside the room, aside from the later dramatics that Khrushchev and his collaborators inserted into the record of the speech. The speech itself was heard in total utter silence. And the fact that Khrushchev could even give that speech tells you that the basis for his rule was quite extensive. And what happened was, of course, is that this is part of the whole process of of retreating quite deliberately from socialism, and but whilst at the same time, rhetorically, in complete contrast to the method of Lenin, who would explain, as you just heard, like there was a retreat and the reasons for a retreat. Then he would look at getting the Bolshevik Party at the time agitators to go out and explain this. With the revisionists, what you got was a screaming that we're advancing towards socialism. We are not retreating. We're going forward. The advance of the party is glorious. We've reached developed socialism. Communism is just round the corner. We're in developed socialism now. We don't need the dictatorship of the proletariat anymore. There's no need for class struggle. Now, all of that, what that amounted to, was a deliberate and mass depoliticization of the proletariat. First of all, you have the abolition of the dictatorship of the proletariat, and then you have the attempt to push Soviet society in the direction of Western European consumerism was an attempt to remove the proletariat from political power entirely by depoliticizing it. That's the element here, the crucial element, I think, that is missed when talking about why the Soviet Union collapses. Because by the time you get to the later period, the Gorbachev period, this is what is going on in the Soviet Union is no longer a battle between the working class and pro-capitalist elements. What it is a struggle between two different pro-capitalist factions within the ruling circles. So you have, like under Brezhnev, you have an attempt to buy other elements within the state and party structure who themselves were part of Khrushchev's coalition, but who got nervous about the advance of pro-capitalist tendencies because their privileges were derived from the system as it currently existed. Now, what the pro-capitalist tendencies of people who were in favor of, like, the Lieberman plan, and people who were later aligned very enthusiastically behind Gorbachev, the openly pro-capitalist elements, what they were in a struggle with these sort of old line bureaucrat elements, and the contest between the two was waged with periodic appeals to the working class, made not by those who were described as conservatives, like the sort of Brezhnevite cadre, but by people like Yeltsin in a demagogic fashion. Yeltsin would demagogically appeal to miners, steelworkers, etc. Said, "Oh, you could be doing much better under the system, the free system that I've got in mind." But what had happened was, because the workers had been depoliticized, because the dictatorship of the proletariat had been abolished, because market mechanisms had already been pushed by the Khrushchev era, and in the Brezhnev era, you've had a situation where the working class's political level had declined to the point where it was no longer active in a serious way. Now, this is something which Mao talks about when he's speaking at the first plenary session of the 9th Central Committee of the party, April 28th, 1969, when he's talking about the reasons for the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. And he's talking about the need for it in the manner of like what's gone on inside the party. Bear in mind, the reason why Mao launches the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution is because he and his fellow revolutionaries realized that the similar thing was happening to them as had happened in the later Stalin period, which is that they had found themselves in a minority on the Central Committee, and that the party hierarchy was becoming more and more pro-capitalist or capitalist Rhoda. So Mao said in 1969, we couldn't do without the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, for our base was not solid. From my observations, I am afraid that in a fairly large majority of factories, I don't mean all or the overwhelming majority, leadership was not in the hands of real Marxists and the masses of workers. Not that there were no good people in the leadership of the factories, there were. There were good people among the secretaries, deputy secretaries, and members of party committees, and among party branch secretaries. But they followed that line of loose Shao cheese, just resorting to material incentive, putting profit in command, and instead of promoting proletarian politics, handing out bonuses and so forth. but there are indeed bad people in the factories. This shows that the revolution is still unfinished. And so what he's talking about there is that the similar things were going on in China as were gone on inside the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, in the later 60s, you had things like the Kosygin reforms. You had more and more emphasis on bonuses for factory managers for achieving various different levels of performance. And this is where you get the emergence of like the factory manager who was corrupt and who lied about all of his all of the production levels and that they'd attained, and you have also at the same time the growth in bourgeois methods all the way across, and the promotion of bourgeois culture all the way across the Soviet Union. So at that time, in the Brezhnev period up to like the early 80s, it was still kind of mixed, and there was some pushback against it from elements within the party. But then the rabidly pro-capitalist wing, built up by through years of pro-capitalist tendencies getting away with it and becoming stronger as more and more not just the promotion of like market mechanisms and bourgeois mechanisms, but combine that with the active depoliticization of the masses, and you get a clique emerging that backed Gorbachev in the early 1980s, who were talking about, oh, there's a crisis in the factories, there's a crisis everywhere, the working class has become lazy and corrupt. And if you read Gorbachev's book, his wretched book Perestroika, which I wouldn't recommend, but he talks in there about the need for labor discipline, and he talks in terms that would be appealing to Ronald Reagan or Margaret Thatcher. Now, of course, Stalin, Lenin, etc., Mao all talked about the need for discipline in the factories and for heroic endeavors of labor, but that was combined with the need to build proletarian power and for the dictatorship of the proletariat. You start to talk about disciplining workers and imposing more regimentation or for more authority for the manager in the factory, disconnected entirely from the question of or disconnected deliberately from the question of proletarian power, and in fact acting against proletarian power, and you get only the growth of like bourgeois managerial tendencies, which of course all swung behind Gorbachev. And so the reason why, of course, Gorbachev is able to dismantle the Soviet Union with barely a shot being fired before it was too late, certainly a shot being fired in his direction, was because the struggle going on in the 1980s was one where the great masses of the Soviet Union, the great proletarian masses, were only appealed to demagogically by the likes of by the Yeltsinites, though even those who opposed Gorbachev and quite sincerely didn't want to see the end of the Soviet Union were also completely unable to appeal to the masses because they had little to no authority with the masses, but also because the masses had been depoliticized. The dictatorship of the proletariat had been done away with. The consistent promotion of proletarian values and culture had got diluted and then just abolished by Gorbachev entirely. And so when you got the Yanayev and others trying to launch a coup in 1991 with the GKChP, as it's called, the State Committee on the Emergency, they had no ability to appeal to the masses, and they were scared of appealing to the masses. And this is why we have to say that the proletariat must never lose the ability to bombard the headquarters, to use an old phrase from the Cultural Revolution. And so without the ability to mobilize the masses in defense of the revolution and against bourgeois tendencies and traitors, then you lose the ability to defend the revolution. And all of that, though, necessitates the dictatorship of the proletariat, which isn't just an administrative system. It isn't just a series of institutions. It is the constant bringing into struggle against bourgeois tendencies of the proletariat, of consistently raising the educational, cultural, and political level of the proletariat, so that the proletariat understands the need for mobilization against pro-bourgeois tendencies, against anything that would seek to dilute its dictatorship, even that which comes from within the party itself. Now, I'm going to pause here for questions. And as I said, this is going to be an ongoing series. So we're going to talk through this over a series of Saturdays. Right. Okay. Let's go up to the top here and take a quick look. Hello to Koloff, the Klingon porn star, porn spelt P-A-W-N. Jack, Robert Svorinich, Al, Arcane Eclectic, Jonas Levinson, Gonzalo Cabrera, Nemo Yederman, who joined us from North Wales, Sid Hatfield, A-Name from San Joaquin Valley. Sid says that I read a lot. Well, I don't read as much as I would wish to. Hello to James Goblin, joining us from the once and future socialist Yugoslavia, which is another country that's an example of like how doing away with the dictatorship of the proletariat led to an utter disaster. Hello to Rob and Beans, suffering in the uncharacteristically hot Yorkshire weather. Steve Fred Johnson, hello to you. And hello to Sean, Red Sailor, anchored off the coast of Cornwall. Hello to Jerry. Hello to Christopher Rogers, live and in person from the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region. Hello to Jawad. Hello to you, comrade. Hello to Comrade Daniel from Somerset. Sid comments, only the bourgeois has a vested interest in maintaining a class society. Yes. Edward asks, how can the proletarian dictatorship be defended from being cancelled by corrupt leadership? Is North Korea just lucky that the Kim family genuinely cares about socialism? I don't think it's a case of just luck, and nor is it the Kim family like the sort of family dictatorship that it's portrayed as. Now, of course, the role of like Kim Il Sung, Kim Jong Il, Kim Jong Un is very important. But I think more importantly, if you look at like the way in which the role the masses play in the DPRK, they consistently seek to politicize the masses and draw them into an active struggle. There's an active struggle against bourgeois tendencies there, and all of the leadership has understood this. And anybody who falls into the kind of bourgeois corruption that's been typical in other socialist countries, unfortunately, those people are rapidly removed, imprisoned, and or killed. So it's, I think, representative of the fact that the system in the DPRK is consistently interested in mobilizing the masses in a serious way in defense of the revolution, and also the fact that they are able to develop the country for all the difficulties that they have faced, and they have an enormous amount of authority because the Workers' Party of Korea, and before that Korean Communists, were the leading element in liberating the country from both Japan and the United States. So you have all that going on, and also the fact is that the Korean Revolution wasn't just down to the fact that Kim Il Sung was an inspirational leader. It's because millions of workers and peasants organized workers and peasants councils in the 1940s and sought to build a liberated country through them. In the north, this became the DPRK. In the south, this was suppressed by a fascistic puppet regime run by US imperialism. So it's a product of the conditions within Korea and the fact that the Korean party has consistently battled against revisionism. Though, of course, they kept relations open with the USSR and the Eastern European countries, whilst criticizing the kind of revisionism that you found in both. Right. How can the proletarian dictatorship be defended? It can only be defended really by the, and we'll get into this in future episodes, but by the consistent high level of politicization, organization, and mobilization of the masses. When that stops, when administration takes over, pure administration takes over, not and the tendency, the bureaucratic tendency towards what could be described as orderly management at all costs. And again, we'll get into this as time goes on, at the cost of proletarian power. Then you see the power of the working class get pushed back. But I will get into this more, Edward, in future episodes. Hello to Bad Wolf, Slumbering Colossus, David Ball, Sophia from Tennessee, in a hot Tennessee apparently. Hello to Jimmy, Enigma, Why Ain't Cool over on Twitch, Bob Parr from the vassal state of Australia, President Jesus from the land of Patrick Bateman, Governor Bateman to his friends. Let's have a look here. Pablo, hello to you over in the US colony of Poland. Robert asks, I wonder if you're familiar with Milovan writings about Stalin. I've got a book by him. If you're not familiar with who Milovan was, he was like a close comrade of Tito. Then he ended up becoming a revisionist, then becoming like an utter reactionary. He wrote a book about reminiscences about the times that he had met with Stalin. I haven't read all of it, but it would be interesting to do a comparison with the Enver Hoxha's book on reminiscences of Stalin. Just going through. Hello to Abtin. Hello to Pavel, who says, I have a few questions. What I could do locally in regards to organizing. Would you be willing to answer some questions via mail or next Q&A? Put your questions on email, Pavel, and yeah, I will pick them up in the next Q&A. All right, hello to Jenny, and Molotov Cocktail says, cultural development. Was there an invisible hand pushing rap music towards materialism and objectification of women, or did that happen organically? Because in the days of Tupac, it was different. Well, it's always been like, let's take the cultural question. Under capitalism, the exploitation and the objectification of women is a key part of capitalism in terms of the economic base. So in the cultural sphere, that's always going to be reflected. And it wasn't rap music that identified that. I mean, rock and roll music got into that as well. Soul music got into that as well, to a degree. Rap took it, certain varieties of hip hop took it further, but what it was really reflecting was a push towards like hyper consumerism and objectification and hypersexualization that you got via advertising and the wider culture industry in the 1990s. But it's partially just a natural development of a rotten capitalist culture, to answer Molotov Cocktail's question. But it's also there is an element of like certain hidden hands there. I mean, there was an element of like the CIA, the various intelligence services being interested in cultural production. But the baseline element of this is the fact that, look, all music in all culture under capitalism is a product of a society based on capitalist relations of production. Now, if you get into a late stage imperialist country where you have a rotting culture with everything objectified, women objectified and sexualized, everything turned into a product, right down, including the women's bodies, everything human sexuality turned into advertising. Like, that's the kind of music and wider culture that it's going to produce. And now, yes, you might get a certain element of those who are interested in pushing society towards that, getting involved in wanting to do that. Maybe certain elements in the US state machine were worried about the influence that hip-hop could have on alienated black youth. But in reality, like that's it's a reflection of the wider culture and the economic base in US society at that time. It didn't necessarily need like the intelligence services to push it in that direction. That was just how it was going to go. Right, just going through some more questions here. Hello to Vera. And how tied to Western capital was Khrushchev? Asks Slumbering Colossus. We're not necessarily tied to it. At least I'm not aware of any evidence of that. But what he was representative of those elements within the CPSU who wanted to cut a deal with imperialism, and the fact that a lot of what he did tried to do was based around being able to do deals with the imperialists. So, for instance, you did get stuff like Fiat opening sort of co-produced car production facilities in the USSR. That was the kind of thing they were interested in. And they got some of it, but not a lot of it. And the imperialists always remained rabidly hostile, because the only thing the imperialists were prepared to accept from any Soviet leadership was eventually what Gorbachev gave them. But no, it's not necessarily the case that he was directly tied to Western capital. Again, I haven't seen any evidence of that. It's that there were tendencies within the party that wanted to go in that direction. Hello to Michael McGoldrick. A name says in 1919 or 1920, the Bolsheviks did try to abolish private property, but material conditions forced them to do the NEP. Yes, it was a retreat and was always seen as a retreat. And as long as you are honest with the masses about why something's happening, you can continue to develop the power of the dictatorship of the proletariat. If you are not honest with the masses and deliberately deceive them, then that works in the opposite direction, which is, of course, Khrushchevite revisionism and Brezhnev periods and what they stood for. Right. Michael, you're joining us from County Derry. President Jesus says, perhaps you could do another show defining the proletariat. I see a lot of confusion with so-called communists idolizing the lumpen or demeaning the low-wage labour as insufficiently working class. Happy to take that on again. I will add that to the ever-growing list. Hello to Svetlana in Prague, to Arcane Eclectic. Christopher Rogers said, I had a horrific flight out of Beijing last week and count myself lucky to be alive after 3 failed landing attempts at Hong Kong. Finally put down in Shenzhen. Wow. Okay, well, glad you got through it, comrade. Christopher Rogers asks, is it my duty to recruit members to the party or ensure that peers are educated about Marxism, Leninism, and the genuine benefits of socialism? Well, kind of both in a way, but like depends upon like where you're active and what you're doing. Like depends upon like what stage of the struggle that we're at. Is it the case that the case that what we're facing now is the urgent need to rebuild a vanguard party, and this is true, I would argue, in most, if not all, of the imperialist countries. There is an urgent need to rebuild the vanguard party, because all of the revisionist parties have withered away and collapsed over the last like 30 years or so, 35 years now. So you need to rebuild. We need to rebuild that, and you rebuild that by recruiting workers who have already come a long way in terms of their own political development. What you would call the advanced workers is what we're looking to recruit and build an organization around now. Yes, if you're given the opportunity to defend the achievements of the Soviet Union and other socialist countries and debunk lies, then we should do so. But our priority is rebuilding the vanguard party. That's the thing, and that's what we should be doing at this stage. Of course, each stage of the struggle unveils new targets for us, new things to struggle over, or a new way for the struggle to be conducted, a new way for the party to organize itself amongst the masses. One has to reassess at each stage. Right. Okay. Hello to Leon Day Nichols, who says his solidarity from Kernosesk in Bristol. Hello to Wicked Witch of the Southeast. President Jesus says Tupac to pretended to be a gangster, not exactly different. Right. Sophia says Pakistan plans to nominate the Orange Baby for a Nobel Prize. This is propaganda, right? Propaganda from the Pakistanis, yeah. Clearly they want to appease Trump in some way, so nominating him for some stupid award would probably do that. I don't think they would give it to him, though, to be honest. But they are doing it. I think it is some sort of crude attempt at sort of managing their relations with Trump. But yeah, I doubt it will succeed. Right, a lot of Tracy Wilkinson. So Leon is a Cornishman. Well, good to have you with us, Cornishman. Right, okay, so 450 of you watching. Thanks to everybody who's tuned in on all different platforms. Be sure to subscribe to the channels either on YouTube or on X or on Rumble, Kick or Twitch. This is going to be a show that we're going to do on a weekly basis, and we're going to be starting off again next week with a look at what do we mean by bourgeois tendencies within a communist party post-revolution. So that's what we're going to be doing next week. I'll bring things to a close for tonight. Thanks everybody for tuning in. Thanks to everybody who supports the show on Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. Patreon exclusive content coming up next week, including Return of the Reading Group, and keep an eye out for that. Until tomorrow, though, I will bid you good evening and wish you a good rest of the weekend.
Небо утреннего стяг, в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, реют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжается бой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы. Будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути.